In this video, we're going to talk about the 1997 Nintendo 64 game, Goldeneye 007. And if you were a child in the 1990s, I'm willing to bet that many nights were spent with friends playing Goldeneye 007 on the Nintendo 64. Along with Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Super Smash Bros., Goldeneye 007 was one of the best video games to come out for the Nintendo 64, and has gone on to become one of the greatest 100 games in the history of gaming. And yet, while this video game was being made, every indication suggested that it might be a failure. First, this game was a movie tie-in, and let's face it, video games based on movies tended to suck. Prior to Goldeneye, when you thought of a movie tie-in video game, you thought of games like The Batman for the NES and Bram Stoker's Dracula for Sega. They just weren't any good, and none of them could really stand on their own. In fact, the only good movie tie-in I remember was the arcade console based on Terminator 2. But that was a coin-op, not a home console game. I'm sure I'm missing a few. Can you think of any good video games that were movie tie-ins prior to Goldeneye? Well, let me know in the comments below. Secondly, Goldeneye was a first-person shooter, and first-person shooters were generally thought of as PC games, not console games. And thirdly, this game was made by inexperienced game programmers, and in fact, everyone but the lead, Martin Hollis, had never worked on a game before. Everyone on the team were all inexperienced, and ironically, this may be the secret ingredient that made the game so good. We'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, this game came out 2 years after the release of the Goldeneye movie. So before the release of the Goldeneye 007 video game, no one in the video game community expected this game to be any good. And to further worsen the expectations, Goldeneye 007 had an unsuccessful premiere at the 1997 Electronic Entertainment Expo, aka the E3, in Atlanta on June 19, 1998. And this is because Rare had to premiere an unfinished copy of the game that didn't have all the shine of the completed game. And furthermore, they couldn't show the entire game, but only portions of it, which failed to impress anyone. Well, the Goldeneye 007 video game was completed and released on August 25th, 1997, which represented 2.5 years of hard work. But when it was released, it blew away fans and the gaming community. The gaming magazines gave it near unanimous praise. IGN rated it 9.7 out of 10, GameSpot rated it 9.8 out of 10, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it 9.5 out of 10, and Nintendo Power rated it 9 out of 10. Fans and critics called it the best multiplayer experience on the Nintendo 64. And this is amazing that Goldeneye the game just flew off the shelves. It sold 1 million copies in just a few months of release, and the next year it sold 2 million copies, and then the year after that it sold another 5 million copies, and by 2001 it had sold 8 million copies, making it the third most successful video game on the Nintendo 64 after Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Kart. Who would have thought that this game would have been so good? Certainly not the creators. The origins of Goldeneye 007 go back to the fall of 1994, a year before the release of the 1995 Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, Goldeneye, and Rare met with Nintendo to discuss a movie tie-in. Rare was an up-and-coming British video game company that was founded in 1985 by two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper. And in 1987, they created the Nintendo game Wizards and Warriors, and in 1988, they created PC Pro-Am. And in 1991, they created Battletoads. And then they made the ultra-successful 1994 game Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo, both using a 3D rendering technique for their 2D games. Now in 1994, Rare had invested in a supercomputer that can create a 3D engine which would create rich three-dimensional environments for video games. And in fact, Nintendo was so impressed with this technology that they invested in Rare and purchased 25% of the company. And together with Rare, Nintendo began to develop their next console system, which was called Project Reality. And they believed that this new chip was such a step up from the Super Nintendo that it would look like reality. And this console would later be renamed the Nintendo 64 and would be released in June of 1996. And Nintendo was very interested in a James Bond tie-in and asked the team to create a game similar to their successful Donkey Kong Country, a 2D side-scroller for the Super Nintendo with three-dimensional rendering graphics, with Pierce Brosnan's James Bond as the main character. However, designer Martin Hollis, who had helped design Killer Instincts and had worked on the code for the new Project Reality, aka the Nintendo 64, suggested they make Goldeneye for the upcoming Nintendo 64 rather than the Super Nintendo, and Nintendo agreed. Now at this time, Martin Hollis and his team were playing a lot of Doom with each other, and they thought Goldeneye could be a similar first-person shooter, similar to Doom. In 1993, there weren't a lot of games like Doom. In fact, how influential was Doom to the genre of the first-person shooter? Well, from 1993 to 1995, there was no term called the first-person shooter. These games were called Doom clones. Well, the Rare team wasn't sure if this new Nintendo console would be powerful enough to handle a game like Doom. Now, spoiler alert, it would be more than powerful enough. But they didn't really know that then, so they thought it might be smarter to rein the game in and make it an on-rail shooter. Because another video game that Martin Hollis and his team played a lot at their local arcade that was close to their office was Virtual Cop. Virtual Cop was an on-rail shooter that had beautiful, catchy graphics. And so the team went to the local arcade and they played Virtual Cop all day and finished it, all while taking notes for their upcoming video game. And so within a few months, they had created the first playable draft of Goldeneye, which was a linear play on-rail shooter where the player moved passively through a 3D world. And while the game worked and did exactly what it was supposed to do, there was a huge problem. The game just wasn't fun to play, and it was clear they needed to rework the game. And then they realized that the Nintendo 64 could handle a Doom-style game, so they decided to create a 3D shooting game that had the 3D first-person shooting mechanics of Doom. But since it was converted from the original linear on-rails game, it maintained the visual look and gameplay of the coin-op Virtual Cop. But the team also wanted that free-roaming 3D world exploration of Mario 64. The director and producer of the team was Martin Hollis. And Martin Hollis was a British video game designer who began programming video games when he was a child. And by the time he turned 16, he had already created over 30 video games. He studied computer science at the University of Cambridge, and upon graduation, he was recruited by Rare. And he helped design the coin-op game Killer Instinct. And then he wrote and tested the code that would run the first chips on Project Reality, which would become the Nintendo 64. Another programmer was Mark Edmonds, and we had two artist designers, Carl Hilton and Brett Jones. And these four were the original team members of the GoldenEye video game. Duncan Botwood joined the team and became lead designer, and Duncan was a video game designer and voice actor who constructed the levels of the game, and he himself did most of the motion capture for the characters. And shortly, designer David Doak joined the team, and David Doak was an Irish designer who moved to England and attended Oxford University to study biochemistry. He got his PhD in biochemistry, and so he really is Dr. David Doak, and was doing research and taught biochemistry for the university, but he was an avid video game player, particularly Mario Kart. And so one day, he quit academia and got a job with Rare. He described it as one day quitting his job and running off to the circus. And his first role for Rare was simply providing network support for Donkey Kong 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. But GoldenEye was the first real project he worked on, and he developed the AI for the characters and the levels of the game, namely how the non-playable characters and the opponents acted and reacted to the player. Adrian Smith and Steve Ellis were programmers for the team, and composers Graham Norgate and Grant Kirkhope with Robin Beanland were music composers who specialized in music for video games. And ultimately, this team ended up working about 80 hours a week for 2.5 years on the GoldenEye video game, and toward the last few months of the game, the team was putting in over 100 hours a week. Early in 1995, the team was invited to the movie set of GoldenEye, where they were allowed to take any photographs for reference. And they were given free rein to walk around and explore the sets and take as many photographs and 35mm home films as reference for their video game, which they did. And they were allowed to visit the set multiple times throughout the filming of GoldenEye. Eon Productions and MGM gave Rare a very broad license to add any James Bond elements into their game. And they decided to go all in. They went for it. They added a bunch of characters from other Bond movies like Live and Let Die, Moonraker, Goldfinger, and A View to a Kill. Brett Jones was the artist and designer who designed the visual look of the characters, and Brett Jones chose Oddjob, Jaws, Mayday, and Baron Samedi. And they added levels from other Bond movies like the Aztec level from Moonraker, where you can find the Golden Gun from The Man with the Golden Gun. And the creators decided to add the other Bonds, Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and Timothy Dalton. But unfortunately, MGM and Eon had to veto this. Although not because of any James Bond lore, but it was because of money. Because they knew that once they included Sean Connery in the game, Connery would sue and they would have to negotiate a massive payout. And to avoid this, if they were to negotiate with Sean Connery at the beginning, then Roger Moore would hear about this and he would also request negotiations, and this would create a chain reaction where eventually Timothy Dalton would request negotiations. And there was no way Eon or Nintendo or Rare would be able to handle this. Apparently, according to the designers, somewhere in the halls of the Rare building, on some electronic file somewhere, is the original Goldeneye video game that has all four Bonds, Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and Timothy Dalton, and you can play them against the Pierce Brosnan Bond. And that is incredible. Who knows, maybe one day this will be found and released. Another thing that was vetoed was in the Aztec level. Originally at that level, there were a bunch of women similar to the women at Drax's compound in South America. However, Nintendo was concerned that the players would enjoy shooting these women, even though they were innocent background characters. Nintendo didn't want a situation where boys would spend a level killing a bunch of innocent women. Therefore, these women were taken out of the game. And for the facial look of a lot of the characters, like the Soviet bad guys, Brett Jones chose people around the office, anyone willing to have their face scanned, and would allow them to be used in the video game. And that's why Dr. David Doak is one of the characters in the game. Dr. Doak is an MI6 double agent scientist in the facility level who gives James Bond a door decoder to progress in the mission. And he also appears in the multiplayer mode. For the game itself, Martin Hollis, Duncan Botwood, and Mark Edmonds would design and construct the level, the interior building that the players would roam around in, and then David Doak and his crew would place about 5 objectives inside that level. And this was very different compared to the way other video games were designed, and it was very time-consuming and very inefficient. However, this created that non-linear feel of GoldenEye 007. First, this created this odd illusion that after completing one objective, the game might suddenly seem to get harder. But most importantly, this meant that the players could roam around and freely explore this open world inside the GoldenEye universe, similar to modern open-world sandbox games, and they might find odd rooms or hidden corridors, even though it had no relation to any of the game objectives. And so, it became the forerunner to the modern open-world sandbox games that we have today. Games like Grand Theft Auto, Elder Scrolls, Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption, Elden Ring, and of course, Minecraft. When designing the game, the designers really wanted the game to be very violent and was inspired by the John Woo movie, Hard Boiled. And when the enemies were shot, there would be a splatter of blood. However, they knew of Nintendo's concerns for violence, and so even before meeting with Nintendo to show them the demo, they were smart enough to remove all the spatters of blood. In fact, Nintendo was very concerned with violence, and later, when Nintendo was looking at the multiplayer game, Nintendo even recommended that after the round was over, all the players would get up and shake hands. Fortunately, this idea was abandoned. But it does give you Nintendo's attitude toward violence in their video games. One of the secret stars of this game is the music. And the soundtrack is amazing. Video game composers Grant Kirkhope and Graham Norgate were responsible for the sound design. And Rare had the rights to use the classic James Bond theme music, the one by Monty Norman and John Barry, but they were not allowed to use any other music from the movies. So Grant Kirkhope and Graham Norgate wrote all the music using bits and pieces from the James Bond theme song. And what they created totally rocks. After completion of the one-player game, which took 2.5 years to complete, a few months before the release, the team decided to add a multiplayer game, almost as an afterthought, using the existing game mechanics and engine of that extensive one-player game. And this would be lightning in a bottle, because it was a multiplayer game that really sold GoldenEye 007 as a hit video game. Because back then in 1997, there weren't a lot of multiplayer first-person shooters. There was Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, Doom 2, and Duke Nukem 3D, and that was basically it. The internet wasn't what it is now, and there wasn't an online community for multiplayer shooter games. Rather, you had LAN parties. But if you wanted to play a LAN game, you had to have a lot of computers and lots of hardware to set this up. If you didn't have an internet cafe in your neighborhood, and it was very expensive, well into thousands and thousands of dollars. And if you were lucky, you had one friend in your extended social network that had a LAN setup in his house. But now, suddenly, with GoldenEye 007, all you needed was a Nintendo 64 console, and you could have a multiplayer game experience. And it was a total game changer. So when the team got the idea for a multiplayer game, they went to programmer Steve Ellis to see if he can create a split-screen version of the one-player GoldenEye game so they can have 2 players. And Steve Ellis, who was a brilliant programmer, was able to successfully do it in just a few hours. And so they asked him if he can split it one more time and see if he could support 4 players. And again, he was able to successfully code for it by the end of the day. Then Carl Hilton and his team created the arena for the multiplayer games, the place where they fight each other, in just a couple of days. And within a week, the basic structure for the multiplayer game was completed, and they were able to play the prototype. And everyone realized how much fun it was to play this multiplayer game. In fact, even people who worked at Rare, who were on other teams working on other games, would come over to the GoldenEye area just to play the GoldenEye multiplayer game. And the programmers knew that they might have something special. And you know how the multiplayer game has these secret nooks and crannies where you can hide and ambush other players? Well, this came from programmer Carl Hilton, because all the programmers used to play each other, and Carl Hilton would always lose, so he decided to cheat. He programmed these little cheats, these little hiding places that only he knew about, so that he would hide there and then ambush his colleagues. And these spots ended up staying in the game. And it just adds that extra pizzazz to GoldenEye 007. And finally, when they showed this multiplayer game to Nintendo, Nintendo loved it. And everyone realized that they might have a potential hit on their hands. And upon release, GoldenEye 007 was a huge success, ultimately selling 8 million copies, making a grand total of $250 million worldwide, which was more than the box office of the GoldenEye movie. And it is estimated that the GoldenEye 007 video game was made for only $2 million. GoldenEye won multiple awards, including the 1998 BAFTA Interactive Entertainment Award and 4 awards in the inaugural Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences. It won the Interactive Title of the Year, Console Game of the Year, Console Action Game of the Year, and Outstanding Achievement in Software Engineering. Electronic Gaming Monthly named it both the Most Addictive Game of the Year and the Best Movie to Game of the Year in their 1998 Video Game Buyer's Guide. GoldenEye 007 has been credited for proving that a first-person game is possible on a home console, leading to games like Halo and Call of Duty. Today, it is frequently considered one of the greatest video games of all time, and many cite this game, along with the movie GoldenEye, as being one of the factors that introduced James Bond to the younger generation. And in 2011, GoldenEye 007 was selected as one of 80 games from the past 40 years to be placed in the Art of Video Games exhibit in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. So, were you a fan of GoldenEye 007? Did you play it when you were young? Let me know in the comments below. Well, that ends this video on GoldenEye 007. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.